All right, there we go. Good morning, everyone. So glad to see you, and the folks who are joining us now or later by the wonder of video. So glad to have you be part of this today. And I am, as you can probably tell from my breathing today, I'm still dealing with my respiratory issues that are not active COVID, even though they are probably residual to COVID. And so if I clear my throat, I'm not spewing COVID at you. I'm trying to use all the precautions. My inhalers are helping a lot on a day-to-day basis as we adjust to our new reality. No, that actually is going to make it worse right now. But what set me off is I was finishing my cold brew with ice on the way down here, and sometimes too much liquid gets everything going. So it's life, right? Hey, Brian, how's it going? Hey, are you going to be out there on Friday with me? Or is that someone else? We're back at DFW. You've got me doing a service out at DFW.
Oh yeah. Go ahead. You're more important. Go ahead.
She is very important. Yeah. Anyhow, it's on my calendar.
Okay. Good deal.
All right.
Good deal. Thanks.
So we're continuing our studies in 1 Thessalonians. And speaking of funerals, that's what I was talking to Brian about. We had a graveside service for Margaret Durbin, our class member, on Wednesday. And that's what I was talking to Jessica about a minute ago as she was at the door. Lovely service, just graveside at Sparkman Hillcrest. And the irony of this, I was talking to the family, and they said, we want to make sure you include Margaret's favorite scripture passage, which is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And I'm like, well, that's amazing because we're teaching, we're having a lesson series out of 1 Thessalonians right now. What's also amazing is with our technology right now, we never really know who's watching out there. Margaret's one of our class members who's not been able to be with us for 2 years at least, I think, and maybe more than that, but has been watching us online the entire time and has been participating in the class up until probably the week before she died. So we just never know. So to all of you anonymous people who are out there, thank you. We're glad you're there. We'd love to know that you're there. If you're not getting our class emails or you'd like to know more, please be in touch with me or with Charlene. And glad you're all out there as well. Just a special word to you. So we come today to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And I'm always learning new things. And like many of you, I grew up in the church. I've heard all the Bible stories. I've done all the children's Sunday school lessons. Been to all the youth camps, been to a Baptist university for 2 years, took the required religion classes, been to seminary. And there are still things that I sometimes have an aha moment and say, I never really understood that. And today's lesson, I got to do some research on why this is the way it is, some of the things that Paul says, and I thought, well, I should have known that a long time ago. And this has to do with Paul's missionary journeys. Now, I will say that I'm probably in my rebellion, wasn't just fascinated with, charting Paul's missionary journeys the way some people are. Anyhow, so remember that in the book of Acts, there's a vision that comes to Paul from a man in Macedonia who says, come to Macedonia and help us, right? The Macedonian call. I got that part. I remember that part. here's what happened in response to that. Paul ended up in time in Philippi. So we have the book in the New Testament called Philippians. That's from a letter he wrote to the church at Philippi. Philippi is in the region of Macedonia, which is in modern-day Greece. When he and Silas and Timothy end up in Philippi, and then later nearby in Thessalonica, because if you look at the map, Philippi and Thessalonica are not far from each other, relatively. And they're both in the region called Macedonia, which is in Greece. And the church that was established at Philippi was the first Christian church in Europe. Barely in Europe. Barely. If you look at the map, it's just hanging off the edge there on the southeastern coast of Greece. But it was an expansion into an entirely new area. And this all matters because, what we have in the New Testament is a collection of letters, primarily. We have the Gospels, and then we have all these epistles, which are letters. And all the letters assume that we have some connecting knowledge that we don't always have. And this is where those studies that I didn't pay enough attention to come in, where you sort of fill in the blanks and connect the letters together, because there's a sense in which they cross-reference each other. So in our letter today, in chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul is going to be talking about what happened to him in Philippi. So as you hear that, just remember that Philippi and Thessalonica are in the same region. They are not far from each other. They would be known to each other. And it seems that what Paul is referencing here with his persecution in Philippi is also what's recorded in Acts, I believe it's chapter 12 of Acts. And you'll know this story too. Those of you who have heard these Bible stories, this is a good one from children's Sunday school too, where the young woman who was demon possessed, and Paul and the apostles healed her, freed her of the demons, but her owners were very upset because she was making money for them with her demonic possession, right? And so they undid the cash cow, and they got arrested and flogged and severely mistreated as a result of that. And we think that's the episode that Paul's referencing in our letter today to the Thessalonians. So it's something that's a story that he would have told them. They would have known, and now he's referencing that. But we've got to go back and piece together the things and sort of have a harmony of all of this. Does that make sense? Yeah, Carol Ann?
This is sort of with this idea, but not completely. If any of you remember the song Send the Light, we have heard the Macedonian call.
That's right.
Send the light.
Send the light, send the light.
Yeah, he did.
The blessed gospel light. Yeah. This is exactly it. And so we know about the Macedonian call, but now we can begin piecing some of this together. So I want us to pick up in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. And again, as I've done the last couple of weeks, I'm taking sort of a literal translation here, and we're gonna comment on it as we go and discuss it. So what I read aloud to you may not exactly jive with what you're reading in your translation, but we got so many translations out there anyway, it probably doesn't matter. He begins by saying, "You yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain, but having previously suffered and having been mistreated," some translations say severely mistreated, which is a true statement, as you already know, just as you know, in Philippi we were mistreated, we nonetheless had boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much conflict, for our exhortation is not in error, nor is it in impurity, nor is it in trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not as men who are pleasing, as ones who are pleasing men, but ones who are pleasing God. The God who examines, who is examining, active tense, the hearts, our hearts. We're going to pause there. I'm getting way ahead of myself on this. It's hard to take a breath on this because it just sort of flows together with all of this. So Paul begins by saying, he's reminding them, you already know what I'm about to tell you. So this is intended as a word of encouragement. You know that we came to you and our teaching among you has not been in vain. It's not been in vain. But having previously suffered and mistreated, as you already know, he says, in Philippi. And this particular kind of suffering here that he's talking about, in a couple of different words here, particularly when we get down to amid much conflict, down in, what is that, verse 2. He's talking about a contest. So the imagery he's drawing on here is one that would have been very commonly used in the Greco-Roman world, and it's the imagery of an athletic contest. It is sparring. It is competing. It is they would use the word contest to mean a competition in a sense. And so what he's saying here is we have been struggling like athletes trying to win the race, which is a metaphor Paul uses over and over again about the race. And here it is again in this passage as well. And he says, we had boldness. Despite that, we had boldness to speak to you the gospel. And here is a word I want to pause on for a moment. The gospel. So in Greek, this is the word, I have trouble pronouncing it, euangelion. Euangelion is the transliteration of it, which is a word that essentially means good news. The gospel is good news. It is telling, in this case, about the coming of the Messiah. So the good news of the gospel in the first century is the story of Jesus. We've come to a point where this phrase, the gospel, means a lot of different things to different people. And for those of you who are following our B&G website, I wrote an analysis piece within the last week, I can't remember what day it ran, that was about this very issue on what is the gospel. Because there's an interesting thing that's developed in our time, and that is people are using the gospel to refer to whatever set of beliefs they have, and they're defining it that way. And so a common phrase that we hear today, especially from the young Calvinists, who are also self-righteous, the Theobros, as I call them, is if they disagree with something that you believe or say, they're going to accuse you of having a belief that is, here's the phrase, antithetical to the gospel. And so we hear this used all the time among this crowd. Now, some liberals have used this too. So, for example, I cited an illustration of someone who opposes capital punishment, who has written and spoken that capital punishment is antithetical to the gospel. Otherwise, on the far right side, we have these Orthodox purists who are saying that all the wokeness and Black Lives Matter and racial awareness and all these things is antithetical to the gospel. Well, what they're trying to do is justify their position. And they're both sort of making their own definition of gospel out of this. We have defined in our time the gospel, again, as being what we think is our set of beliefs. And that's not what the word originally means. When Paul, in his letters, talks, as he often does, the gospel, what he's meaning is the good news of Jesus. It is the news of the Messiah. It's news of the resurrection. It's not a full-blown doctrine of everything we might want to teach in the church today. The gospel is not a comprehensive doctrinal statement. It's a very simple thing that has to do with Jesus being the Messiah, born, ministered, crucified, raised, coming again. There is a theological statement in that, but it's not a well worked out 5,000 word theology, right? It is a very simple idea that is the thing that ought to unite us, not to divide us, right? So Paul does not have in mind here what some of us might have in mind today out of our more fully developed sense of the gospel. So let's pause. Does that make sense? And what thoughts do you have about this particular issue, the gospel? Anyone?
Mark, we even use the term, it's the gospel truth.
Right, so we say it's the gospel truth, which is an affirmation of something that's absolutely true.
I've also heard it's not biblical.
It's not, yeah. And so I would go with you more on it's not biblical than it's not gospel, right? Because biblical and gospel are two different things, ultimately. This is a great point, Pat. I can get off on a whole nother rant about whether something is biblical or not is the only measure that matters. Because what is your definition of biblical? Stoning people is biblical. It's in the Bible, right? Lying is biblical. It's in the Bible. Now, decimating entire people is biblical. It's in the Bible. That doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. So just being biblical, and you're right, we use that a lot, is not necessarily the end-all test of something. You've got to have a little more definition than that, right? But yet we often want to come to these shorthands. Does this make sense? Other thoughts on this? Thank you for that great point. Yeah. Anyone? I'm trying not to get on a complete rant here.
Well, is anything that makes us different from any other part of Christianity is, even within Baptists, you've got different kinds of Baptists.
Oh, yeah.
And you've got Presbyterians different from Methodists, different from Catholics, different from Baptists, different from Seventh-day Adventists. They're all feel they're Christians. I'm not saying they are.
Right.
But the differences between us are, we would look at the others and say, but they're not being biblical. They're not being antithetical.
They're not being biblical. So baptism is a great example of this. We Baptists look at people who baptize infants and say, that's not biblical.
Yeah.
Right? They may look at us and say something else we do or believe is not biblical. The problem is this gets extrapolated into all sorts of social and ethical issues that aren't necessarily addressed in the Bible.
Also political.
So it becomes very political in this. And the problem I have is when any one sect or section of Christianity believes they have the sole corner on the market, and everyone else who doesn't believe exactly like them is antithetical to the gospel, which is baloney. right? It's just baloney. So that's something that would have been foreign to Paul in this context, I think. Okay? That's first rant of the day.
Feel free to rant. It'll be fun to watch.
Okay, don't want to stir my asthma too much on this. So we're here at the end of verse 2, the gospel of God amid much conflict. And we talked about that. So in verse 3, for our exhortation, and the word exhortation here is meaning our proclaiming of, our teaching, our speaking is not in error, or it's not impure, and it's not trickery, because we have been approved by God to be entrusted with, and that's the important word here, entrusted with the gospel, again, this core message. So we speak not as those who are pleasing men, but as pleasing the God who examines our hearts. Now, here's the news flash of the day. There were televangelists in Paul's time. They just didn't have TV. And what Paul, yeah, Ann?
Did any of y'all see the 2020 segment this week on Tammy?
Oh, on Tammy Faye Baker? Oh, no.
On 2020.
Yeah, okay. So Ann's saying there was a 2020, the TV show segment on Tammy Faye Baker.
He's apparently living in Branson, Missouri right now.
Yeah, so Jim Baker's still crazy as a loon. I mean, he's hawking fake COVID cures on the internet right now. And he's a perfect illustration of the kind of thing that was happening even in Paul's day, where there were people who were sort of Professor Harold Hill again, going around from village to village, selling their wares and telling people what they wanted to hear, right, in order to take their money. They were, the official word for this is hucksters. They were hucksters, and they did so under the guise of being religious or philosophical teachers. And so Paul is comparing himself and Paul and Silas to them to say, we're not like them. We're not here to take your money. In fact, what he's going to say in a minute is, I didn't take any of your money, because what we came preaching was not to raise money, because Paul and his companions seemingly paid their own way by being tradesmen. Susan, do you have something to say?
No, I just was going to ask when he says we have been approved by God, where did that mean?
Yeah, so we have God's seal of approval. It's like the good housekeeping seal, right? What he means here is that we have been put to the test. The Greek word in this actually means to examine. So it is, in a sense, like the good housekeeping seal of approval. Our message, he says, has been tested and tried and found to be true. It is not fake in this. That's really what he's saying in this. So the word approved is not necessarily the best translation here, but yet it's what we have in English. Yeah. Okay, are you with me on this? So he's drawing a contrast between their teaching and preaching, their ministry, versus those hucksters who come through to say we're not like them. And he says God has examined our hearts through this. And this sounds a little arrogant. It does sound like Paul in that regard, but I don't think he means it in an arrogant way. He's just trying to, I guess, as we say here in Texas, it's not bragging if it's the truth. That's sort of what he's trying to get at through this, probably. Verse 5, never at any time Did we bring to you a word of flattery or a pretext for greed? God is our witness to this. Nor are we seeking from you, from men, glory, glory from you or for others, because with authority, with the weight of authority, we are Christ's apostles. We are Christ's apostles. Now, it's interesting here that Paul uses the word apostle in this. And we could get off on we could have a whole lesson on the meaning of the word apostle and debates about who is an apostle and who's not an apostle, right? Because by some definitions, Paul is not an apostle. By some definitions, only those who had firsthand experience with Jesus and went on to teach are the apostles. Now, Paul's case is that he was grafted into this because of his Damascus Road experience, right? That he too had an experience with the risen Christ. It was different than others, and therefore we would still call him, we frequently say, use the identifier, the Apostle Paul. It's interesting to see him use this very word of himself and his companions. Verse 7. Unlike the others, there's still contrast going on here, we were gentle in the midst of you. And here he comes up with another analogy, as if a nursing mother would cherish her own children. And that speaks to us of tenderness. What he's saying is we didn't come to you with harshness. We came to you with a gentle spirit and message here. And it was like this nursing mother and her children. We so yearned over you and were pleased to have imparted to you not only, and here's the word again, the gospel, third time in 8 verses that we've come across this word, the gospel of God, but we also gave you our own lives because you have become beloved to us. And this word beloved has its root in a Greek word you're going to know. In this form, it's called agapetoi. Do you hear the word agape in there? Beloved. It's out of this root word for love that we know to be a special kind of love. You've heard 500 sermons on this, I'm sure, on the 3 kinds of love in the Greek language, and I won't even go into that right now. That's the root of this word beloved here. And I think as I read this and was thinking more about what's going on, it occurred to me that what Paul is promoting in the early church, as we see over and over again, is a kind of personal fellowship. The early church, the church Paul envisions, is not a cold, impersonal place. And this is something that has bothered me throughout my life in various churches that I have visited in different places, and I've been in a lot of churches in a lot of different contexts, is sometimes you walk into a church that feels like nobody really knows each other, and everybody just sort of gathered there to do their obligation, right? And there's not a sense of fellowship there. Certainly not one that transcends that hour that people are together. And I think one of the hallmarks of an authentic New Testament church is some sense of belovedness that you connect with there. Now, certainly, people are looking for different things, and some people are going to connect more than others. But I think what Paul is illustrating for us here is the need for authentic church community to be about community and not just about being in the same place at the same time. It's not just about doctrine, it's about fellowship. It's not just about a person, it's about being in personal relationship with others. To Paul, community is a very important concept. And it's part and parcel of believing in Jesus and being part of the church. Anyone else have a thought on that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you ever walked in a church that was cold as a mausoleum? Yeah.
I'll say it, but I was really just scratching my neck, but the church back then was the church in the home kind of stuff.
That's right.
Right? So it wasn't hundreds of people listening to a preacher.
That's right.
It was more of a agape type fellowship type thing.
That's right.
Sharing, I guess, what God's done in your life.
Yeah, so for those at home, Jim is saying in the first century, the church was not hundreds of people listening to a preacher. It was a home fellowship type thing. And so this is more naturally bred. And the outtake of that is the right way to grow a big church today is to have a lot of small churches within a big church. This is basic church work, right? And this is why some very smart people have made the case that just gathering 5,000 people in a room on Sunday is not necessarily church.
And that's what a Sunday school class.
So that's what hopefully happens here and in other ways. And this is the very thing that COVID has threatened the most. It is the very fabric of relationship in the church because we have had to stay away from each other. We've had to be distant from each other. And this is where some of the far-right people who've really made a thing about not wanting to shut down church, I get their point. The essence of church is being able to be together. You can still have church, as we know, and not be together. But as Paul would indicate here, that relationship, and I have made the case through COVID, that the reason churches have been able to survive COVID is because of the relationships they had before COVID. If you had not had some existing relationship that drew you together, so when we were online only, the fact that you already sort of knew each other allowed you to imagine what other people were saying. So if someone made a comment on our Facebook Live thing, you could envision, most of you, who that person was, right? And so it's not completely foreign to you. You've not just landed somewhere. But there is a limit to how far that can go. And God knows we have tested and are testing that limit right now. Thank you, Jim, for that point. Gave me another little platform out of this. Verse 9. You remember, brothers, our labor and the hardship that we worked night and day in order not to burden any one of you. Again, what he means by this is they were not only preaching and teaching, they were doing another job. Paul and the others were what we would call today bivocational. And we don't know exactly what the vocation was. Some speculate Paul was a tent maker. He was some sort of a tradesman, for sure. Something that was clearly portable that he could do from place to place as he went. In order not to be a burden to any one of you, we proclaim the gospel of God this way. In verse 10, you are witnesses, and God is a witness, how, here's an interesting word that gets translated into English. You don't see this in your translation. Holily, Holily, with holiness, right? And with righteousness and blamelessly towards you, we were, just as you know how each one of you, as a father of children, exhorts and comforts and is charged to walk with you, worthy of this calling of God's kingdom and glory. And again, what Paul is trying to say here is that we came and lived among you, and we tried to model for you a gentleness, a way of life. And the key to this is in verse 12. There's a word that probably is translated in your English version as to walk or walking, walking worthily with you. And this is the key to the whole thing. The Greek word, you're going to recognize the root of this again too. The Greek word is peripaten, which has to do with peripate, which is perpetual, which has, it's a word that's used multiple times by Paul in the epistles that means to walk. Peripateo, to walk. And what Paul is talking about here is not just a set of beliefs, but a way of life. And this is what is so difficult for us to live up to this standard, because he's saying to the church here, it's not just what you believe, but it's how you live day to day. It's how you walk. To walk as Jesus walked, to walk with faithfulness, right? It is this daily living that he's calling us to, and this is where we all, I think, true confessions, struggle.
When you said that word, that base word, it made me think of peripatetic, and then I couldn't remember what that meant, so I looked it up. And it's interesting, it's traveling from place to place, in particular working or based in various places for relatively short periods.
Yeah, peripatetic is the other word, and it means traveling from place to place, right? There's a place in the Gospels where it says, and I remember this because it's a line in Celebrate Life, those of you who are old enough to remember that musical, that Jesus went from town to town and village to village proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. You remember that line, Jim? Yeah. Jesus went, Jesus walked, Jesus was going. And this idea of going is always so prevalent in New Testament teaching, but it's again, it's not a one-time thing. It is a lifetime thing, right? Dwight, this word made me think of you and your career as a mail carrier, walking every day from place to place to place, doing the work. You were exemplifying that kind of thing because the work you did was by going. It was not by standing still somewhere, right? And this is what Paul is saying to us. We are called to embody these virtues as we go from place to place every day, touching people along the way with the gospel, which is, again, the good news of Jesus Christ. Thoughts, comments, questions on these 12 verses? Look at that, we covered 12 verses today. Yes.
I remember a book that I used to have years ago. I think the title was something like, "Why Haven't We Won the World?" And in there he raises the question, why was the early church seemingly so effective in reaching people? He said it wasn't because of organization, they didn't have any.
Yeah.
It wasn't because of prestige, that was absent.
Right.
It wasn't because of political power.
They didn't have that.
None of that. It wasn't because of buildings. It was just that they had an appeal because people could notice among them they were different. They cared for one another. They loved for one another. This fellowship that drew others to them. That's
an excellent point. And for those at home, the reference is to a book that talked about the early church and how were they so effective in spreading the gospel. It wasn't because of political power or prestige. They didn't have any of that. It wasn't because of organization. They didn't really have that. It wasn't because of buildings. They didn't have that. But it was because of the koinonia, the fellowship, the love, the agape. And that's exactly what Paul's getting at here in speaking to the church at Thessalonica to say this is what works, right? This is the formula. This is the magic that happens. Yeah.
Why do you think so many people are so, in my opinion, fooled today by the ministers of mega churches that are standing there in a $5,000 suit and Gucci loafers, and some of them have a message, some of them don't, but there's just so many people that, to me, don't equate
Right.
what that minister has got to what the congregation.
So the question for those at home is, why do I think so many people are so easily fooled by the megachurch phenomenon or the televangelists or the hucksters of our day, right? And by the way, not all megachurches are hucksters. Some are. I know some small church hucksters as well. So, you know, the answer, I think, is that it's the human condition. We gravitate toward easy answers, and hucksters always give you easy answers, maybe sometimes to questions you don't even have. You know, it's like going to the state fair and walking through the building there where they're selling all the home products, and you find things you never knew you needed before. I mean, who knew you needed a 50-piece knife set to slice, dice, and do all these other things until you stand there and listen to that pitch, and my God, I need that knife set, right? How have I ever lived without it, right? So there's that element to it. But I think there's also a lot of following the crowd that happens, and it happened then. It happens today. The largest church is not always the best church. And again, just because you have 5,000 people together doesn't mean you're actually having church. Yeah.
I think also there's this mode of using your brain. It's easier to have someone else tell you what to do. You don't have to think. And then you have to...
Oh yeah, using your brain and people, a lot of folks love being told what to do. Believe it or not, they really love being told what to do, especially when it comes to religion, because they feel so inept themselves. They think, well, surely I'm not smart enough or spiritual enough to figure this out. Someone needs to tell me what to do. And that's what happens, I think. What's old is new again. Some things never change, we see through this. All right, we've reached the end of our time. Before we sign off with our video, let's pause for a prayer together, and then we'll have our prayer concerns here in the class as well. God, thank you for the message of hope from your word, and we pray that you would let it sink deep in us and help us to respond and live well accordingly. I pray for each one who is gathered here and is listening in relationship with us now, to know your peace and your presence today, and to be filled with your Spirit. Through Jesus Christ. Amen. All right.